It was a cold afternoon in January 1988 in a small rural town in Vermont. The wind howled through the empty train station of Maple Falls, carrying snow flurries that danced around the wooden platform. Helen Carter, 53 years old, stood alone with her suitcase beside her, wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf. The train had left 20 minutes ago, and no one had come to meet her. She had traveled all the way from Ohio, leaving behind a quiet apartment and memories she no longer wanted to live with. Her children were grown and scattered. Her marriage had ended years ago, and silence had filled every corner of her life since. She wasn't looking for luxury, just a reason to feel needed again. When she heard a man named James Miller on a late-night radio station looking for a good-hearted woman who doesn't mind quiet nights and cold winters, something inside her stirred. She wrote to him. He replied. Letters turned into months of quiet hopes. James promised a small cabin in the woods, a place to grow vegetables, and soup always on the fire. "I'll be at the Maple Falls station on Saturday," his last note read. "I'll have chicken soup in my hands and a ring in my pocket." Now, with the sky darkening and her toes numb, Helen felt doubt creeping in. What if this was a mistake? What if she had been too desperate, too trusting? She sat on her suitcase, pulled her scarf tighter, and whispered into the wind, "Please let him come." Just then, she heard footsteps crunching in the snow. A tall man appeared at the far end of the platform, coat flapping in the wind, a wool hat dusted in snow. He held a tin container wrapped in cloth. "Miss Helen Carter?" he called, voice deep but gentle. She stood slowly, startled and unsure. "I'm James Miller. I'm real sorry I'm late. One of my horses broke through the fence this morning. Took me hours to track her down." He stepped closer, breath visible in the cold, and unwrapped the tin. "It's chicken soup," he said, lifting the lid. "Still warm." The smell hit her like a memory from childhood, her mother's kitchen on snowy days. She took the tin with both hands, warmth seeping through her gloves. James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box, inside a simple gold ring. "I know we haven't looked each other in the eye until now," he said softly, "but I meant every word I wrote. If you're still open to it, I'd be proud to build something real with you." Helen looked at the ring, then at his face. He wasn't polished. His beard was rough, his jacket patched. But his eyes were kind, the kind that didn't look away when life got hard. "I came all this way hoping you'd be here," she said, voice cracking. "I am here," he replied, calm and steady. She looked at the soup, the ring, and then back at him. "Then I'll go with you." James nodded, relief plain on his face. He tied her suitcase to the back of the wagon he'd left down the path and helped her up beside him. As they rode through the snowy trees, Helen leaned against him, the tin of soup between them, still warm. By the time they reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light flickered through the windows. James helped her down gently, hands lingering at her waist. "I made space for your things," he said, a little shy. "Didn't know if you'd really come." "I did," she said, "and so did you." Inside, the cabin was small but clean. A fire crackled in the hearth. On the table sat 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and a cloth napkin folded neatly with a sprig of pine in the center. "I wanted to ask the right way," James said, suddenly straightening. He knelt down and held up the ring again, calloused fingers trembling slightly. "Helen Carter, will you marry me?" Her breath caught. Her eyes stung. Not from the cold this time, but something deeper. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Yes, I will." He slid the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly. For a moment, they simply stood there, quiet. Then he brushed her cheek gently. She leaned into it without hesitation. He kissed her, slow and unsure. But she kissed him back, and warmth bloomed between them like a fire long waiting to be lit. That night, they sat near the hearth. Her feet were tucked under a wool blanket. The soup now filled their bowls. The ring warmed her finger. James sat beside her, his hand resting over hers. "I know we're still strangers in many ways," she said quietly, "but this feels like something good." He nodded, eyes soft. "It does to me too." The next morning, pale light poured in through the frosted window panes. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but the room still held the soft warmth of wood smoke and something else: quiet companionship. Helen had risen early. She sat at the edge of the small bed, pulling a shawl over her shoulders, listening to the distant sound of hoofbeats and birdsong. Outside, the land was still frozen, and the trees stood bare. James was already out, feeding the chickens and checking on the mare that had broken through the fence the day before. Helen stepped outside, boots crunching over snow and frost. "Sleep all right?" he asked, not looking up. "Better than I have in years," she replied. "That straw mattress fooled me." He smiled, brushing oats into the feed trough. In the days that followed, their rhythm began to take shape. James woke before dawn, worked the land, split firewood, and repaired fences. Helen tended the cabin, scrubbed the floors, and kept meals simmering on the stove: soups, cornbread, boiled apples with cinnamon. They didn't talk much, but their silences felt full rather than empty. One afternoon, while Helen swept the porch, she found a feather caught in the railing. She brought it to James. "Guess a hawk came through," she said, twirling it between her fingers. He looked up from the firewood stack. "They circle when they sense something's vulnerable, but I think this place is starting to feel strong." She didn't answer, but something in her eyes said she agreed. That same week, he brought her a small potted basil plant set in an old coffee can. He placed it on the windowsill above the sink. "Hardy little plant," he said. "Keeps bad spirits away. Adds flavor to stew, too." Helen smiled, watering it with leftover tea. Over time, things grew between them, in quiet ways. Their glances became easier, their movements synced. In the evenings, she stitched new curtains from the fabric she'd brought, and he mended tools by the fire. She shared stories from her past, growing up in Cincinnati, summers on her grandmother's porch, the taste of warm cherry pie. He listened closely, nodding occasionally, as if storing every word. One rainy morning, they were reinforcing the henhouse. Helen slipped in the mud, landing hard on her knees. James rushed to her side, but she waved him off, laughing. "You thought I was delicate?" she chuckled, brushing herself off. "I wasn't sure," he admitted. "Well, I didn't come here to be porcelain. I came to be part of something." That night they sat closer than usual. She rested her head lightly on his shoulder. He let his hand cover hers, steady and warm. Changes started to appear in the home. Helen rearranged the shelves, brought out hand towels with blue stitching. James replaced the leaky faucet, added a second chair to the porch. "I wasn't sure if you'd stay," he said once, quietly. "I wasn't sure either," she replied, "but I want to." One afternoon, James returned from town with news. A nearby neighbor, Mrs. Adler, had a sick grandson, and the family couldn't get out due to snowed-in roads. Without hesitation, Helen packed jars of soup, linens, and a bundle of dried herbs. "You don't have to come," James said. "I want to," she replied. "Helping's not a chore when you're part of something." The trail was rough, snow piled high on either side. They rode through the white silence, the sky heavy with clouds. By the time they reached the small cabin, the boy was burning with fever. His mother wept, exhausted. Helen worked through the night. Cooling cloths, herbal tea, whispered reassurance. James kept the stove burning, brought more water, never said much, but stayed near. By dawn, the boy was sleeping soundly, color returning to his cheeks. His mother hugged Helen, whispering, "Thank you," over and over. On the ride back, neither spoke. The woods were still, trees glazed with ice. Near the edge of their property, James finally stopped the horse. "You didn't have to come," he said again, quieter this time. "I know," Helen said, "but I'm here. That matters." He looked at her then, not just a glance, but truly saw her, Something softened in his shoulders. "You belong here," he said. "Not just in the cabin, but here, with me." Helen touched the side of his hand lightly. "Let's not talk about belonging. Let's talk about building." He didn't answer right away, but his hand turned in hers, and he held it like it was something precious, something he didn't want to lose. The seasons were still hard, but the space between them was not. Summer arrived quietly in Maple Falls. The days grew longer, the sun brighter, and the fields around the cabin hummed with bees and wind. Helen and James had slipped into a routine so smooth it felt like it had always existed. But even the calmest waters can hide a current beneath them. Something began to shift, not all at once, but slowly, like paint fading on an old door. James spoke less. He came home later from his work in the woods. Helen at first didn't think much of it. She kept the meals warm, kept the basil alive in the window, kept writing small notes in her ledger. But eventually, the silence between them stopped feeling peaceful. One muggy afternoon, as Helen was hanging herbs to dry, James came in, dripping sweat, holding a cracked axe handle. "Did you move the toolbox?" "No," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "It should be where you left it." "Well, it's not." He didn't yell, but his voice held an edge she hadn't heard before. Later, she found the toolbox exactly where it always was, tucked beneath the bench by the door. She said nothing, but the weight of it settled in her chest. That evening, she served stew and cornbread. James ate in silence. She tried to speak about planting squash next week, maybe building a cold frame. He nodded but didn't engage. Finally, she asked, "Are we all right?" James didn't look up. "I don't know," he said. She felt a lump rise in her throat. "What does that mean?" "I mean, maybe this was too fast. Maybe we should have slowed down." She stared at him, the flickering lamplight catching in her eyes. "Are you saying you want me to leave?" "I'm saying I don't know what I'm doing. I haven't had someone in my space like this in a long time." Helen stood slowly, folded her napkin, and left the table. That night, they barely spoke. The next morning, Helen didn't make breakfast. She packed a few things in her old suitcase, wrapped a piece of bread and jam in cloth, and walked out the front door without a word. She walked until she reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the same place they'd once stood, watching the hills turn gold. Now she sat on a weathered log, looking at the sky. Her hands were still, her eyes full of thought. Back at the cabin, James noticed right away. Her shawl was gone, her boots too. He looked at the empty space beside the fire and felt a hollowness open wide inside him. He ran. He followed the trail through the trees until he saw her, alone, motionless, staring out at the sky. "Helen," he called. She didn't turn. He walked closer, slowly. "You leaving?" She didn't answer for a long time. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "Whether being here is still worth it. Whether I'm building something, or just waiting again." James sat beside her on the log, not touching her, not speaking yet. "I've always kept things inside," he said finally. "My last relationship was nothing but shouting and walking away. When it ended, I got used to doing everything alone. Silence became survival. Then you came, and suddenly I wasn't alone. But I didn't know how to stop hiding." Helen looked at him now, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't come here for a roof and warm soup, James. I came for something that takes work. I don't want perfection. I want truth." He nodded slowly, hands clasped between his knees. "I messed up." She didn't answer, not right away, but she didn't leave either. After a long pause, she said, "We can't build anything without honesty. We don't have to be perfect, but we have to show up for each other, even when it's messy." He turned to her. "I want to. I want to try again, properly, if you'll have me." Helen stood, her back stiff from sitting. She looked down at him and nodded. "All right, let's go home." They walked side by side down the path, slower this time, but together. When they arrived, James took her bag from her hands without a word. She set the bread on the counter and poured water for tea. He sat across from her. This time, his hands didn't fidget. He looked at her like he finally saw her, not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as someone who mattered. The next day, things were still quiet, but different. James fixed the barn door that had been creaking for weeks. Helen made a stew and left it warming, knowing he'd come in before sunset. Later, sitting on the porch, she turned to him. "Next time you're scared, don't run." He nodded. "I won't." And though there were no promises spoken out loud, something settled between them again. This time, not just comfort, but commitment. The days grew cooler again, slowly shifting toward fall. The rhythm between Helen and James became something steadier, not perfect, but intentional. The air inside the cabin held less silence and more understanding. Every shared glance, every quiet task carried a kind of trust that hadn't been there before. One morning, Helen left a small note on the kitchen table. "Thinking we ought to make it official. What do you say?" James read it over coffee, smiled, and disappeared into the small closet near his bed. He returned with a tiny velvet box, worn but still whole. "I've had this ready," he said simply. "Just wanted to be sure." She opened it. 2 silver bands, simple and unadorned. "I'm sure," she said. They drove to the courthouse in Brattleboro the next week, under a sky so blue it felt unreal. Helen wore a soft green dress she'd sewn herself, pinned at the collar with a button James had carved from cherry wood. He wore his best shirt and combed his hair back. They signed their names in the county registry. No one asked questions. The clerk offered a quiet smile and said, "You two take care of each other now." Afterward, James bought her a small roll of floral fabric she'd admired weeks earlier in the store window. He didn't say much when he handed it over, but his eyes did. Back home, they pinned their marriage paper to the back of the pantry door, next to a recipe Helen had written out for blueberry pie and a dried sprig of lavender. It was their own kind of altar, built not from ceremony, but from small, honest moments. As the leaves turned gold and red, they worked side by side. Helen preserved apples and stewed tomatoes. James replaced the roof over the shed and reinforced the barn before snow could settle in. One crisp evening, as the fire crackled and the light outside dimmed, Helen sat knitting a scarf. "You ever think it's too late to start something real?" she asked. James, polishing a tool beside her, didn't hesitate. "No, not if it still feels right." She nodded, her hands never stopping. "I think this is the first time I've felt rooted," she said. "Not passing through, not waiting for the next chapter, just here." James looked at her, eyes soft in the firelight. "I think I stopped waiting too. The day you showed up with that red scarf and brave eyes." They didn't say much more that night, but both of them felt it, this quiet certainty that what they had built mattered. Neighbors began stopping by more often, bringing jam, asking James for help with fencing, asking Helen for her bread recipe. People were drawn to the warmth of their home, to the story that had grown between them. But Helen and James never shared every detail. They kept some moments just for themselves. Each morning began the same. Helen by the stove, James feeding the animals, the porch creaking under their steps as they crossed paths. One morning, she found a small feather tucked beside the basil pot. She smiled and placed it in her notebook, where she now kept more thoughts than records. She wrote, "Roots don't need to be deep to be strong, just real." In early spring, they built a garden box together near the south-facing wall of the cabin. Helen pressed seeds into the soil, squash, tomatoes, marigolds. "These are from Ohio," she said. "Brought them with me. I didn't know where they'd end up." James placed a hand gently over hers. "They're home now." The first blooms came in late May. They celebrated with coffee on the porch and a long, easy silence. That summer, a neighbor offered them a pair of goats in exchange for help hauling lumber. James built a new pen out back. Helen stitched names into the collars with red thread. At night, they sat by the fire, her legs tucked under his, her head on his chest. They still had arguments, days of tired silence, days when James got lost in work or Helen closed up. But now, they knew how to come back to each other. One afternoon, as the first fireflies blinked across the field, James took Helen's hand and led her to the ridge where they'd once almost parted ways. The valley spread out below them, green and gold, wide and steady. "You still think we rushed into this?" she asked with a teasing smile. He gave her hand a squeeze. "No, I think we just found what we needed before we knew how much we needed it." Helen turned to him, eyes filled with something calm and strong. "I think we both did." Years later, when someone asked how long they'd been together, James would shrug and say, "Since before the frost left the ground." Helen would smile and add, "That's when the roots took hold." And that's when they stopped waiting, because love had finally stayed. Some stories don't start with fireworks. They begin with soup in the cold, a quiet voice, and the courage to stay. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments. Do you believe in love after 50? And don't forget, follow the channel for more stories like this one, because it's never too late to begin again.